Good evening, everybody, or good morning or good afternoon, depending on the time zone. And welcome to another Historical Materialism broadcast, brought to you in cooperation with Haymarket, which generously offer us the use of their YouTube channel. My name is Panagiotis Sotiris. I'm an editorial board member of Historical Materialism Journal. And tonight we're having a discussion on Massimiliano Tomba's Insurgent Universality and Alternative Legacy of Modernity. In the latest issue of the journal, the last issue of 2022, we had a symposium on Tomba's book, which included interventions by Tomba himself, by Aldo Beretta and Rebecca Friedzel, by Vanita Seth, by Harry Harutunian, and Nicholas Fletcher. And tonight we are having with us Massimiliano Tomba, who is now a professor of history of a professor at the History of Consciousness Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. We have Aldo Beretta, who is a research fellow at the Center for Humanities and Social Change of Humboldt University in Berlin. And we also have Alberto Toscano, also a member of the editorial board of Historical Materialism, a professor at Goldsmiths University in London, and a visiting professor in Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. The format of tonight's discussion is we will start with an introduction by Massimiliano, then Aldo and Alberto are going to intervene. We're going to get questions from the audience so that we have second round of comments and discussions. I will act as chair, but I might also say a couple of things. I had the honor of writing the introduction for the symposium in historical materialism. Those of us who are watching us, please, if you want to post any questions, use the chat function at the YouTube. We're going to take the questions from there and relay them to our speakers. And as usual, I will end this introduction with an urgent plea to support historical materialism by subscribing to the journal, by donating whatever you have. If you came here through Eventbrite, you know we ask for any kind of donation, by buying the books, either through your institution, through Brill, or a year later when they appear in really affordable prices through Haymarket. And without further ado, I pass the floor to Massimiliano Tomba.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you for inviting me and for having this conversation. So I think I am supposed to say a few things about my last book, Insurgent Universality. Let me start with the reason why I wrote the book. So when I started writing Insurgent Universality, I had a few questions in mind. I think common questions. Many of us have a similar questions. So one is that the idea, or even the myth of history, the sense that history as a final goal, this idea, final goal, this idea, this teleological understanding of history as collapsed. I think it's difficult to find people around who really believe that history has a final destination today. And then the question is how it's possible to rethink politics and history without teleology. So this is basically the one of the main idea in the books. So when I started writing the 4 historical chapters, the idea was basically to dig in these historical events without a unilinear historical conception. The idea was to find different trajectories, different historical trajectories and competing alternatives. So the other big question I had in mind, also related to our present, is that at least in part of the world, big institutional structures like mass parties, mass socialist parties, radical unions, all these big institutions have collapsed, as I said, at least in part of the world. And the point is, again, so how can we think politics, what the politics looks like without these gigantic institutions? A third question I had in mind is about, let me put it in this way, the possible parts constraints, so the positive part of our political discourse. So what I mean is that we know a lot about the crisis of capitalism, the crisis of democracy and the state, but rarely we know or we have an idea of with what we want to replace these things. How is possible to think in positive terms, real alternatives, and not only thinking about that, but to point out experiments, events in which these alternative emerge. What I mean is that basically, and this is another assumption of the book, I think that many of our categories, or the categories and concepts that we use to think about political transformation, a lot of these categories and concepts are exhausted, are no longer able to imagine a different present or a different future. At the same time, I don't think we can generate categories from scratch. The only alternative I was able to see was, and this is how I organized my work, is how it's possible to extract new categories and concepts, or maybe even a kind of a normativity from historical events. So not from theory, but from historical events. So the idea is that in the events that I consider in the book, and they are the one specific moment of the French Revolution, the 1793, the Paris Commune, 1871, the beginning of the Russian Revolution, 1918. I choose 1918 because it's the year of the first constitution, when they brought and when they brought the first constitution. And then the last chapter is 1994, another date that is for the Zapatistas insurgency. So the idea is to consider these insurgents as a theorist, as the activists whose practice is a theory in action. And then what I try to do is to extract categories from their practice that I consider as a theory. I read their declarations and manifestos as I usually read Hegel, Kant, and Plato. theoretical text, and I paid the same attention to what they wrote in their declarations. So the point is very simple in a certain way. If it's true, let's assume that it is true that our concepts and categories are exhausted, then what I've done is to consider these practices from a theoretical point of view as a step ahead. So as a theory that is ahead than the practice, than the categories which are available to us. So in a certain way, is the theory that has to try to catch up with this embodied theory in practices, and not the other way around. It's no longer theory that can dictate practice. Is no longer theory that can dictate practices, what to do and what is the next step. Another thing that is crucial in my book is, and I say that already, that when I consider these historical chapters, these 4 historical events, and basically I'm doing something similar in my new project, but with the more recent events. What I do is a kind of art of digging into the past in order to find and reanimate interrupted alternative trajectories. And obviously, in doing that, I am very influenced by people like Walter Benjamin and Ernst Bloch. So the idea is that there is a future, or if you want the plural, futures encapsulated in the past. There are many trajectories which have been interrupted, crashed, violently crashed. For example, this is part of my new project, the 1525 German Peasants' War, in which an alternative modernity was possible and was experimented by these peasants, and Thomas Müntzer was brutally, violently crushed. The peasants were massacred by what has become the dominant modernity, so Luther and the princes and the modern state on the other side. So the idea is not to write, this is important, I don't write, I never write an history of victims and defeats. For me, it's the other way around, is how to write these histories of what Benjamin would have called the struggling, the oppressed, struggling classes. I want to reanimate those struggles as a kind of a task for us in the present, to reanimate and to accomplish today what has been interrupted in the past. This is the Benjaminian gesture in the book. At the same time, these other trajectories show us in action, in the concreteness of the experiment, different categories, different forms of possession, different forms of self-government, and forms of communities which are not conservative or reactionaries, but they are different forms of being together. So they showed us a form of political togetherness that is not organized around people or sovereignty, as a nation sovereignty, as a unity, as the unity of the state. Indeed, all these experiments are organized around a kind of a pluralism, legal pluralism and pluralism of powers, in which the state can still exist. It's not a war against the state, but the state becomes a kind of a unit among many units. And the state is limited not by a system, a check and balance system, but is limited by the the coexistence of many other powers and authorities. Obviously, what you get is a political configuration that is kind of a more unstable and can be even risky, because conflicts can emerge all the time. And sometimes people object that my alternative is too unstable and too risky. I would say usually my answer is yes, but politics has to do with the risk. Politics has to do with this kind of how to deal with the instability. Otherwise, if we want a stable political configuration, I think the dominant modern political theory has many models for this kind of stability. So we can go back to Thomas Hobbes, and then we can try to understand the state as a mechanism that neutralizes conflict. So this is basically the trajectory that goes from Hobbes to Carl Schmitt. But I think we need something else. And this is something else is another thing that I try to emphasize in the book, and this is maybe my last point, is the democratic excess that always emerge in these events. What is the democratic excess? This is not a term that I invented. This is actually a term that Robespierre used against the radical sans-culottes. And when the radical sans-culottes in the during the French Revolution in 1792-93, when they claimed they didn't claim, they practiced their right to convoke their assemblies whenever they wanted and to recall representatives. This is what is called the imperative mandate, and to question the decision of the convention. So when all these assemblies in their actual practice question the sovereignty of the convention, Robespierre say that this democratic excess can destroy the nation and can destroy the state. Now, the point is that Robespierre was right, but for the wrong reason. It was right because it's true that the democratic excess can destroy the state, but the state that the democratic excess destroys is the state that is based on national sovereignty, unity, and the representation of the people, nation people, as a totality. This is the kind of a state that Robespierre was the kind of state that the French Revolution was realizing, was putting in place. But as I say, there were alternatives, there were other trajectories which the French terror has crushed and repressed. In a certain way, the French terror is or was the way through which the dominant trajectory of the modern state was established. And so what I try to do in this book is to trace the kind of history of this democratic excess, and basically to restore the dignity of this excess as something that breaks the continuity of what I call the dominant trajectory of modernity, state, capitalism, private property. So breaks this continuity and gives space and provides some space for the alternatives to the state and the capitalist form of production. So this is basically the big theoretical framework in the book. And as I say, The theory in the book is basically condensed in the first chapter, and then there are 4 historical chapters in which I do exactly what I just said. I try to extract theory from concrete events, concrete cases. That's it.
Thanks a lot, Max. And I pass the floor to Aldo.
Thank you very much, Massimiliano. Thank you very much. And yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to divide my commentary to Massimiliano Tomba's book in 4 brief sections. Section 1 has to do basically with some theoretical resources present in Insurgent Universality. Section 2 takes or is based in my critical observations to what I believe to be the fundamental concepts or notions of Massimiliano Tomba's book, namely temporalities, universality, and insurgency. Section 3 takes into account Massimiliano Tomba's response to the article that Rebecca Fritzl and myself wrote recently within the symposium. And section 4 is more or less a final note in this initial dialogue based on Massimiliano Tomba's book. So, the first section, some theoretical motives in Insurgent Universality. In my view, the fundamental theoretical resources employed by Massimiliano Tomba to supersede the dominant conception of time are mainly based on Koselleck, Bloch, Marx, and Benjamin. This is quite clear, quite transparent in the book itself. And as Massimiliano just stated, these are, I believe, to be the concepts or the reference points through which also Massimiliano conducts this kind of dialectic between theory and practice, theory and historical practice. So, on the first place, Koselleck's notion of historical times. I believe that this concept plays a decisive role. For Koselleck, human individuals and human communities have a space of experience where the past is present and enables action. Associated with this space of experience, individuals and communities act with reference to specific horizons of expectations. Historical time, then, is the relation between specific experiences and expectations, namely the internal dynamism of a specific life world where experience, the past, and expectations, the future, are coordinated in a particular form. Second, Tomba also has recourse to the notion of multiverse introduced by Ernst Bloch. Also, I would claim a fundamental pillar for understanding Massimiliano Tomba's book. Especially Bloch in his 4th thesis on the concept of progress, for whom the underlying historical unilinearity presupposed in the concept of progress had to be challenged by the voices of history joined, I quote, in perpetual and often intricate counterpoint. I believe that this to be also very important. The critique of the unidirectional development of history, as Massimiliano Tomba just mentioned, associated with progress, was put into question by a multi-directional articulation of diverse historical experiences and expectations. On the third aspect, or the third motive, inspiration probably, I would be tempted to say that this is the basic inspiration, but I'm not sure. It's based on Karl Marx, and especially on Karl Marx's response to Vera Sasulic, or at least the attempts or the drafts that Karl Marx wrote as an attempt to answer those letters that he received from Vera Sasulic. In this case, Tomba recuperates the notion of contemporaneity as a co-presence between the capitalist mode of production and different overlapping forms of existence. The topic of the forms of existence, Daseinsformen, is already present in the Grundrisse, but I think that in the drafts written as a potential response to Vera Sasulic, Marx shows a different kind of overlapping between the capitalist mode of production and the diversity or the plurality of forms of being. For example, the Russian commune conceived as a non-homogeneous historical process. And I think this is also an important inspiration for Massimiliano Tomba. Fourth and last, Tomba also draws upon, this is, I believe that this is the decisive element, draws upon two elements from Walter Benjamin, especially thesis 16 and thesis 17 of his on the concept of history. These two elements would be A, the critique of the notion of the continuous course of history, and B, the reconstruction of the suppressed past. This articulation, or these two elements put together, make sense by articulating the critique on the representation that historicism withholds regarding the past as a closed reality, inaccessible to reflexive intervention, towards which the historical materialist creates an experience with the past to blast open the continuum of history. Such a reflexive intervention, I claim, this is what Massimiliano Tomba attempts with his book, a reflexive intervention, enables an interruption of the linearity of history, because the historical materialist recognizes a revolutionary chance in the fight for the oppressed past that discovers the unrealized possibilities that have not yet become history. What actually Massimiliano Tomba just referred to as futures, capsules of futures interrupted in the past. As Tomba indicates, following Benjamin in his book, it is about working with the roads not taken or repressed, which, from the past, can shed light on the possibilities that were left unfinished, but remain vital to reimagine our present. So those would be some theoretical resources that I believe to be central for understanding or creating some kind of dialogue with Massimiliano Tomba's book and theoretical endeavor. Second section, my critical observations. So my first critical observation to Tomba's argument relates to the, I wrote about this, the indistinctive terminology at play of temporalities as a formal concept and historical temporalities as their multiple concrete realizations. I believe that if this distinction remains unclear, the term temporalities, although pluralized, could entail a relapse towards a Kantian model where history is configured in time, instead of what could be called a post-Hegelian motive, where history is the configuration of time, correlated by social practice. Pluralizing and culturally situating the concept of temporalities does not necessarily indicate that human practice constitutes social space and time. On the contrary, it could mistakenly point the predominance of time over history. My second critical remark would be that even when the synchronistic force of a dominant temporality is counteracted by a recognition of the plurality of temporalities, the notion of time as the realm where social practice takes place should be questioned if the coexistence of unrelated particular stories aims to achieve some kind of unity. Giving up the challenge of historical correlation by implicitly granting predominance to the coexistence of plural temporality could make the conceptual resources articulated by Tomba shift to a relativist interaction between different constellations of experience and expectations without any mediation or without any apparent mediation that links them together. My third remark would be that in order to avoid this relativistic shortcoming, where the only alternative would be an overlapping mosaic of particularities, it would be necessary to maintain both premises of the Zapatista resolution together, namely, one world where many worlds fit. This is precisely because not only the consequences of the universal, the abstract universal, if I may, or the false universal, if I may, upon the multiple particulars should be critically reevaluated, but also the very structure of unity needs to be theoretically reconsidered. In this sense, following Adorno in his excursus to Hegel, I subscribe that the view that a true preponderance of the particular would not be attainable except by changing the universal. In my view, this could be possible through the notion of concrete universal, namely the Hegelian unit of identity and difference and its reformulation by Theodor Adorno. This more or less summarizes also the observations that I wrote together with Rebecca. I'm nevertheless accentuating or underlining some, stressing some points here. The third section is a very brief description or reconstruction of Massimiliano Tomba's response. In his response to our article, Massimiliano Tomba indicates, and this is a very big quote, that the notion of universality emerges from the historical chapters of historical universality, not from a definition or a concept that he could have had included in the book's introduction. The theory he extracts from concrete social historical practice serves to challenge, and this is for me a key phrase, serves to challenge dominant concepts and categories in modern political discourse. The one world in my work, that one world that we discussed previously in the Zapatistas' resolution, one world where many worlds fit. So the one world in my work, a quote from Tomba, is constituted by the incompleteness of the experiment, also a fundamental statement. These experiments share something, an idea of universality, key element, which is unstable, fragile, and incomplete. End of quote. taken into account the importance of Tombas response, I would now try, as a final note, to better understand Massimiliano Tomba's contribution to the debate on universality. And I would attempt to do so very briefly by focusing on the title, Insurgent Universality. Insurgency being the initial moment and universality the possible outcome. Insurgent as an event, as a practical, social, political event, would be the initial critique, and universality the possible outcome. These two elements are related and have an internal connection. Insurgency as a critical movement recognizes a false ideological universality. Insurgency also reveals a disciplinary synchronization through an abstract temporality and challenges its dominance. Insurgency would also unify calendars and geographies in the attempt of liberating itself from multiple oppressions and its categories, and at the same time, creating a possible reciprocal recognition between the plurality of temporalities. In this sense, maybe insurgency could be acquainted with the notion of contradiction, maybe a practical contradiction. The contradiction, like insurgencies, would then reveal what is missing in the so-called notion of universality, what is missing in the given political categories of our time, and open the path for unrealized possibilities of transformation. For example, a world in which many worlds fit, always in a fragile, incomplete, and unstable way. That's it.
Thanks a lot, Aldo. Alberto?
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to participate in this discussion that follows about 3.5 years ago when I think we launched the book in person at the Historical Materialism Conference in London. So it was also really interesting to return to the book after the intervening passage, and also now speaking about the book from a different political and geographical vantage point, speaking from unceded First Nation territories in Vancouver, territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations here in Burnaby, and from a situation in which many of the juridical, political, and temporal questions raised by Massimiliano's book have a different resonance than they might have had for me in Bloomsbury in 2019. So maybe we can develop some of those ideas as well. And one of the things that struck me in rereading the book was really its capacity to not just to propose a whole set of conceptual, methodological, and critical perspectives to revitalize our political thinking and action in this period of what Massimiliano in his initial comments called that of the collapse of historical teleology and of the institutional and organizational paraphernalia of dominant modernity. But also to really blast open the temporalities within which those frameworks take place. And so I was kind of, especially in the discussions of the theorizing, as Max rightly notes, the theorizing that takes place, right, in the declarations, decrees, and constitutional texts that he discusses, there was something for me of the effect of reading a wonderful fictional text, but I think a very political fictional text, which is a counterfactual communist science fiction novel from the 1980s by Terry Bisson called Fire in the Mountain. Fire in the Mountain is a wonderful text that I highly recommend, at whose core is the fictional premise that the book is written from the perspective of a future world in which John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry set off successful slave insurgency, and the book is written from the standpoint of Black socialist republic in a United States that's split in two, where the North is social democratic and the South exists in kind of, you know, full communism. And the story of John Brown within the book is a nightmarish tale. So the story of our present, of what followed the John Brown raid, and of the counter-revolution of property against Black Reconstruction, that's the horror story that people in this other future tell their children, right? And the children are horrified by this book that circulates, which is basically a book retelling our history, right, as their nightmare. And reading some of Max's studies in the historical chapters had somewhat of that effect, right? Both opening up the alternatives, but also, I think, stressing the nightmarish character of the paths that were taken, right, rather than the ones that were not. Now, one of the things that, again, in returning to the book, I thought seemed to me extremely significant was the way in which, especially in the texts that Massimiliano focuses on, you have something like a practical critique of the separations that dominate and oversee the modernity that is here an object of critique, right? Above all, and I think this is very significant also in terms of Massimiliano's continued concern with the political constitution and destitution of property, I think I was, you know, particularly struck in returning to the book by the way in which, whether it's the Soviets and the constituent assemblies and the decrees in 1918, or the Zapatista declarations, we have ways of thinking the entanglement, the imbrication of the juridical, the political, and the social in ways which are not just extremely suggestive, but I think also have their own urgency. And also, I think, might push us to criticize what we could see as some pseudo-alternatives, right, to modernity, or at least some truncated or limited alternatives. So for instance, I think especially in the chapter on the Russian Revolution and its impasses, Massimiliano provides extremely powerful antidote to the traducing of the phenomenon of the Soviets in Hannah Arendt's On Revolution. Hannah Arendt's On Revolution, which depends on reinstating, albeit in a different key, those separations, right? By saying, you know, the problem with the Soviets was that they busied themselves with the social question, the kind of remarkably absurd critique, in my view. What else could they busy themselves with, right? But forms of life, social relations, relations of property, and so forth, right? And I think then linking this practical critique of the separations that govern dominant modernity to the question of temporality and anachronism is, of course, crucial to the book. I think it's also, and this might be among historical materialists, reason for further debate amongst ourselves and with the audience. I think by focusing especially on the question of the relationship between property and possession, the Russian terms are not immediately available to me, but nevertheless, the distinctions that Max philologically extracts, right, from these texts, I think we also have a basis for what I think is an pleasantly unfamiliar critique of Leninism, right? So we're used to, you know, in the kind of logical geography of the left or the far left, we're used to a set of, you know, by now somewhat reflex moves, right? Anarchist critiques of Leninism and councilist critiques of Leninism and Menshevik or social democratic critiques of Leninism. But I think Max's kind of inhabiting of these texts coming largely, you know, politically and ideologically from the world of the, you know, left wing of the social revolutionaries does bring out an area of critique and debate that is not really kind of dealt with, right? Because often the critiques take place at a level which is, again, speaking of separations, purely political, right? At the level of just the centralization of power, or the question of violence, questions of revolutionary expediency, and so on and so forth. But I think articulating it in terms of the practices and theories of property in this revolutionary phase makes for a much richer discussion, right? About the impasses, the limits, the legacies of Lenin's practice, and then, of course, use Leninism with some scare quotes, given that it's also just a doctrinal, retroactive, and Stalinist projection. But nevertheless, right? I think these are questions that can open up quite fruitful avenues of debate. And I think in this sense, I find, though maybe in some ways complementary, Massimiliano's intervention more fruitful or generative than the nevertheless very important and interesting work, for instance, of Pierre Dardon and Christian Laval, right? Around the relationship between political forms and property forms, which I think in their case hinges far too much on a kind of Proudhonian anarchism and on a somewhat less inventive repetition, right, of the discussions between anarchist and Marxist perspectives, right? So I think it's one of the virtues of Massimiliano's book that it doesn't sort of repeat in a new sauce the split in the First International, but does something else. So maybe I just wanted to then finish off with some open questions, right, that the book leaves me. One has to do with what is at stake in retaining the categories, notions, watchwords, right, of modernity and universality. And of course, in the book and in his interventions in the Historical Materialism Symposium, you know, Max does some quite nuanced answers to these. But I do wonder at times whether some of these trajectories stretch, right, these notions of universality and modernity, perhaps almost to a kind of breaking point. And I was also thinking, you know, of histories, right, of phenomena that some might include within either dominant or alternative trajectories of modernity. Take the Haitian Revolution, which do not necessarily easily fit the parameters of really any kind of conception of universality or modernity that is maybe available to us. So I was thinking, for instance, of a really interesting book by, I think, a former student of James Scott's, John Henry Gonzalez, Maroon Nation, kind of alternative history, right, of the Haitian Revolution, a history of the Haitian Revolution really as a revolution that continues, right, after the constitutions, after 1804, as a revolution against the anti and post-colonial state, right, as a revolution against state formation of any kind, but also a revolution that is entirely, or at least a set of interlinked peasant-based insurgencies, right, and resistances that doesn't necessarily have any particular interest in France, in the French Revolution, or indeed in linking up with other revolutionary movements elsewhere, right? I was kind of struck about, kind of like what we do, right? It's not really a separatism, right? But what we do about insurgencies that don't think of themselves, right? And it's not enough to see them as universal from an external standpoint, right? If they don't necessarily practice that universality. So that's one question, right? About the limits of the reinvention of modernity, and or the question of an alternative modernity or universality. And I guess the last point that I think is very interesting to think through, and I also think about this as a really live political and juridical issue, including in context of struggles for actual rather than merely ideological decolonization in the present, is a question of what the material and in a sense the political economic conditions for the pluralisms that Massimiliano is exploring, right, in the text. And I was thinking, for instance, of the way in which the pluralism enacted, right, in some of the documents that coming out of the left social revolutionaries in 1918 depend on the existence, right, of forms of life, of professional categories, of labor organizations that are distinct and therefore, right, have a possibility of formulating their own autonomies, right? What happens to these frameworks in situations where there aren't, right, such forms of life, right, to rely on. That's of course not, or at least not entirely the situation in indigenous struggles, but certainly if you think of what juridical pluralism might mean for downwardly mobile lower middle classes in European metropoles, it's not entirely clear to me that there are any forms of life to build autonomy on, right? At least not in the sense that we would have found in 1918 in Russia, right? And therefore, I wonder how much, I wonder what the conditions of translatability, right, are between juridical pluralisms that have land, not just as a category, but like as an experience, right, as a form and as a relation to domains in which that is not, right, the primary kind of like basis material or lived for politics. So I find the proposal very suggestive, even attractive, but I do wonder, right, about for instance, the translatability, and that's something that was experienced in a kind of sense as a failure of translation of cognitive mapping, right, throughout the so-called alter globalization movement of the 90s, extremely inspired by Zapatismo, but it's not clear to me that it was able to draw any, practical juridical political lessons, right, from that model. It was very inspiring, but I'm not sure, it was translated into the conditions of the metropolies in so-called advanced liberal capitalist domains in ways that had any real vitality. So I kind of wonder about that. In any case, it's been a real, real pleasure to kind of return to these discussions. And I think they also, as I sort of suggested by mentioning the work of Dardot and Laval, but I could mention tons of other different perspectives. I think Massimiliano's book is also part of a broader, if not necessarily convergent, set of efforts to link juridical, temporal, and political questions, especially around rethinkings of property, of thinking of the work of Robert Nichols or Brenna Bandar and others, that I think is really a kind of vital area, right, for discussion. So I'd also be interested to hear from Max how he sees his own work, right, in terms of these ongoing dialogues and debates.
Thanks a lot, Alberto. And take the opportunity to remind our audience that they can put questions in the YouTube chat function, and we will relay them to our presenters. So far, we do not have any questions, so I take the opportunity and use a little bit of chair privilege just to throw a couple of one or two thoughts. Well, what I really think important about Massimiliano's book is something that he mentioned today when he said that treating the insurgents as theorists, which I believe is very different than treating the insurgents as moralists. That is, what Marx does is he goes beyond what we might say a form of Kantianism from below. The idea that you can find, because the idea that you can find normative aspects in subaltern struggles, or you can find is something that you can also treat it in other relations, not other traditions, not necessarily historical materialist in the broad sense. And I think what is important is exactly that it's not just about, because the danger in that case, the case of a Kantianism from below, is that it goes into the vicious circle of always treating, instead this as already constructed as, Kantian subjects, whatever this would mean. Whereas I believe that you offer a much more fruitful, in a certain way, description of the kind of dynamics that emerge through subaltern struggles and the potential they entail, the potential they entail in the production of social forms, new ways of thinking, and new forms of, new forms of institutions. I think this is very important. And I think this is also very pertinent in contemporary debates, because if you look, and it's a very good coincidence that, we're discussing this at a time where we're, looking with expectation, for example, what is going to happen in France, when you see the kind of, return of really mass movements and, forms that might even get a kind of insurrectionary dynamic. And I think it's your book is very useful as a reminder that any possible politics of emancipation is exactly about treating the insurgents as theorists, treating whatever is happening within movements and these dynamics as the laboratory of political forms, which is something very different to the approach from, let's say, most of left-wing tendencies, which, whether they acknowledge it or not, basically are, I like to use this word, and I use it in a pejorative way, left populists. That is, they have a kind of politics from above, that politics in the end is always about a discourse that someone is going to hear and then follow, instead, well, let's say, a politics of listening and learning of what, actual people are doing in their actual struggles. And I believe that your book contributes to that, also adding in a non-historicist way the importance of temporalities. I mean, which I think is also very, very, very important. I mean, for someone like me coming from a very supposedly very strongly anti-historicist tradition as a good Algerian, the question of history is always, you know, a lacuna, is always a very open question, because history is something that is there in memories, is there in traditions, is there in monuments, is there in material traces, is there in narratives that continue to be repeated, etc., etc. And yeah, finding a way to bring back historicity and temporality in all their discordance, I think it's very, very, very important. And I think to that end, your book is also a very important contribution to that end. Anyway, that was just my comment. Yes, and if you want to respond.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for all your comments and questions. It's a lot. I think I need more time. Let me see what I can do in a few minutes. That is not the time of my answer. It's the time I need to think. I am a very slow thinker. So let me try to put it this way. And I want to start from the end. So yes, as Panagiotis has said, you know, it's treating the insurgents as a theorists. That was one of my guidelines, and it is one of my guidelines in the book. And the sense of you know, treating them as a theorist goes really deep in a way that you know, when Aldo correctly listed a few names, Koselleck, Bloch, Marx, and Benjamin, I would add, yes, and then the insurgents as a part of you know, the same kind of constellation in which the concept of the term, I don't know, the term of time and history can be reconsidered, but in their own practice. So basically what I'm saying is, you know, if we want to try to use a more sophisticated language, I think what Koselleck, in my opinion, missed is that time can be temporalized in different ways, in many different ways. For Koselleck, only modernity temporalized time, and for that reason, pre-modern experience do not have the sense of anachronism. So only the modern can distinguish between what is a synchronic and what is an out of sync and the anachrony. Now the point is that this is correct, but only for the modern concept of time, and this is correct only for the way modernity temporalizes time, and basically from the perspective of the future. But when we pay attention to these other theorists, the insurgents, then something else happens, and we can see that you know, I need again historical concrete examples to make theory. So, for example, the communards in 1871, they restored, and the language restoration was very present in the Paris Commune, as it was in other big insurgencies. They restored the imperative mandate from Middle Ages. And this is written in some of their documents. They restored the communal freedom, liberties, again from Middle Ages, and so on. So the point is, they were not afraid of two things. They were not afraid of restoring anachronisms in the present in a way that these anachronistic institution from the point of view of the dominant temporality. They were anachronistic. This is what the French Revolution slipped away. But they tried to restore some of these institutions. So they were not afraid of the anachronistic character of these institutions, on the one hand. And on the other hand, they were not afraid, by doing that, to make an explicit reference to Middle Ages. That again, from the point of view of the dominant modernity, the Middle Ages is just a dark age, is everything that is opposed to freedom, equality, civilization, modern, everything is a negative, has been defined as something that belongs to Middle Ages. In one word, modernity invented and had to invent the Middle Ages as a polemical concept. Now, in the practice of these of the communards, Middle Ages was just an arsenal of possibilities. This is the Blockian intuitions. The past is full of possibilities, is full of futures, and the point is how to reanimate these futures, how to reactivate these futures in the present, so that they can lead to a different configuration of the present and therefore of the future. So what is interesting again is that to think about temporalization of time and practices of history and making history, I think we need to put in conversation all the thinkers. I agree with you, Aldo, they are fundamental in my training, in my education, in the way I think. But we have to put these thinkers in conversation with the other thinkers, the other theorists, the insurgents. And I think is this something sooner or later I wanna write. I think this is the starting point of a real alternative canon. An alternative canon is not a canon, philosophical, theoretical, canon of political theory, a canon of Western canon, whatever you want to call it. An alternative canon is not a canon that includes some of the thinkers who were excluded from the canon. By including these people, you make it just the canon a little bit larger, and you don't undermine the very logic of the canon. The canon can be expanded. You can add a chapter and you can have thinkers who were excluded in the past. Doesn't change anything, in my opinion. What can change the logic of the canon is this tension between what we consider the canonical thinkers and the insurgents, the activists, as a theorist. So when we start putting together theory and practice as a theory in action, that I think can lead to a different understanding of the canon. So if you want an example, it's like yes, we can write about John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, but I'm not saying that I am so original that I am the first one who thinks such a thing, but we have to write about John Locke, and we hold John Locke on the left hand, and at the same time we have to read all the documents and the declarations of the diggers, and try to understand Locke as an attempt or as a kind of as a weapon against that other possible trajectory, the trajectory of the diggers and common possessions and self-government, that because that was a possible outcome of the English Revolution that has to be crushed. And I think if we started doing these kind of things, we can see how basically both are using the same passages from the Bible and the Gospels, but they read the same passages in the opposite way. So I think there is a lot of work that has to be done in what an alternative canon looks like. I think I would say, my humble contribution to an alternative canon is try to put in conversation all these insurgents and how they think, not only about some institutions, that is extremely important, but how they practice time differently. When they use terms like restoration instead of revolution, and how their use of restoration helps us to rethink the meaning of revolution today, and the trajectory of the concept of revolution, especially after the French Revolution, that became basically the revolution through which the state shapes society. But at a certain point, you have a society that pushes back, and society tries to restore a different configuration, a different framework of institutions. So this is the kind of history I'm interested to do, and that requires a lot of theory. And I think can be said, and I said already, for sovereignty, and how the practice of this democratic excess, the practice of a pluralism of the many assemblies and Soviets can help us to rethink a legal framework in which sovereignty is dispersed. But that means, again, that means that we have to work with a political framework that is more unstable, and in which, and maybe I'm going in the direction of what you said about the pluralism, that I try to answer from a different angle. So this pluralism that is also, is not only a pluralism of events and a pluralism of historical trajectories, but in this case can also be a pluralism of assemblies and authorities. So now the point is that does this pluralism go into the direction of relativism? My answer, I think we agree more than what we think, or maybe we know that we agree, because I think we use a different language and different terminology. I suppose I abandon some of this gay terminology like a contradiction because maybe just because it belongs to my youth. I wrote on Hegel. I wrote a book on Bauer. I wrote articles on Hegel again, and then I try to move on. And basically, I try to do with the history of philosophy what I'm doing now with the history. I try to understand, okay, what the history of philosophy looks like if we work with a different kind of line, a trajectory that goes from Kant to Fichte to the Romantic, Schlegel, and you can see that I want to end with the Benjamin, and we have basically this other trajectory that can skip Hegel, and then and you have a theory and philosophy that works with a different theoretical arsenal. I think history of philosophy can also be rewritten in a way that we can see branches instead of the big unilinear course of history. That is in a certain way very Hegelian. This is how Hegel taught us history of philosophy. At a certain point comes Fichte that solves some of the contradiction of Kant, but then Hegel solves the contradiction of Fichte, and said, no, maybe not. Maybe Fichte was going in a different direction, and the Romantic got it, and so on. So I think so. Now, what about pluralism and relativism? That is I think is an interesting question. So I think we agree on one thing. Obviously, we agree that universality cannot be defined in terms of opposition to a common enemy. This is a very, very, very weak form of communality. It's extremely fragile. So then we need to understand a different way. So what is a universal in what I call universality? I think you are correct in this when you cite the Zapatistas. Again, they are our theorists. So one word in which many words fit. And then I would say the difference between what we are saying and the, let me put it this way, now I'm polemical, but and the decolonial discourse is that the decolonial discourse emphasizes the many words and the plurality. And in a certain way, they even forget that there is a one word in which all these many words fit. What we want to say is, no, be careful, there is a one word. Now, our problem, our task, our theoretical and political task is how can we define this one word? And then, you know, I think at this point, I think there is work that has to be done. And but at this point, I can only repeat what you just said by, I think you were citing me. I think for me, this one word is the incompleteness of the project. It's still that. So what does it mean that the project is incomplete? If I take back one term from Bloch and Bloch on this essay on differentiation on the concept in the concept of future, Bloch ended his essay with this idea of the human, the humanum. Now, what we can say is that we don't know what the hell is the human. We don't know what the humanum looks like. This is, if you want, this is the Kantianism in the best way, but this is the Kantianism of Bloch. So this is a kind of a human that transcends specific forms of humans. Is still a kind of idea. Is something that we need to realize, but we don't know how. So this is the openness of the project. But the openness of the project gives us something more than that. Gives us some guidelines and gives us a very specific and important political guideline. So that basically what is not acceptable in this pluralism is an experiment that is based or grounded on the exclusion of other experiments, because that experiment doesn't accept itself as incomplete. I would call this a latter form of experiment a fascist experiment. The fascist experiment excludes other experiments. The fascist experiment defines itself as the truth, as a complete, and basically deny the incompleteness of itself. So these kind of experiments are unacceptable in the idea of incompleteness and openness of the experiment. Otherwise, I think, yes, there are different ways we can manage with these pluralities of powers, institutions, authorities, and as I say, tension and conflict can emerge. So I'm not dreaming, or yes, I'm dreaming, but I know that is a dream, at least so far, the dream of a future peaceful society in which there will be no conflict. I have no idea. I have no idea. Probably we will manage with the conflict for hundreds or thousands of years. I don't know that. What I know is that I want to consider conflict as a dimension of politics. So better to learn how to deal with the conflict than to try to neutralize conflict, because we know the trajectory that try to neutralize conflict. This is the trajectory of the modern state. And the price we paid, and we are still paying for that trajectory, is pretty high. And I think it's enough. I don't want to pay that price anymore. So, and that allows me to go to the last point against something that I can learn from the insurgents, and this is about the property. There's something that Alberto pointed out, the differentiation between property and possession. And what I learned from the insurgents, but now is a different examples, and this is a case in my new book, in the work of Anachrony, is something that emerged, and not only there, but something that emerged in the 2000 water war in Cochabamba, in Bolivia. So when there was an attempt to privatize the water, the insurgents were against the privatization, but they were also against the nationalization of water. So what I thought was interesting there was this kind of attempt to break the binary privatization, nationalization of water. What they did was to restore / reinvent indigenous traditions, forms of customs, traditions, reciprocal obligations, and this reconfiguration of a past and present gave rise to something else that they called social property. Now, what is interesting about social property, and I want to stop here, is that a social property is not a right, and we can start seeing a different grammar that is no longer the Western legal grammar. So social property is not a right. Social property is a practice, but is a practice that gives priority to obligations over rights. And I think this is also very interesting, because when you have obligations, you have reciprocal obligations among users, and then you have a limit, and then you have the possible democratization of the use of common resources. So in a certain way, what you get is that a radical democratization of the use of common resources redefine the grammar of property in a way that the binary national private is broken. And I think this is for me crucial. This is what I can learn from practices from the insurgents, and I think for me is more valuable than 15, 20 books on the concept of a property, because this is the alternative theory in action. It failed, yeah, more or less, but it still exists in some part of Cochabamba, in neighborhoods and so on, and not only there. I think at this point, let me put it this way: how do I think about what I'm doing? I don't think I can provide a solution for the kitchen of the future. I think I can only try to provide categories and concepts that I extract from these practices. And then when we have a different language, maybe we can start thinking differently. And if we start thinking differently, we can give rise to different practices. So in a certain way, I think of myself in a kind of a very humble position in which I can only learn from these insurgents how to rethink about my own work and theory. I know there is more than that in your comments, but I think there are also some questions from YouTube. So I should stop here, but I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Yes, thanks a lot, Max. Well, so far we have one question from the audience. You can read it in our chat, and I will also read it. It's a question from John Barry. And the question is, what does the panel think about right-wing populism having a more effective political strategy than socialists at this current historical moment in their embracing of insurgent disruption? This is the question we have. And I also urge the audience to, post more questions. Now, this is a question for the entire panel, and I guess also Aldo or Alberto want to, again, respond to both this question and also Massimiliano's response. So I suggest Aldo or Alberto, you go first. You want to comment in any?
Sure, why not? Well, insurgent disruption on the populist or far right. There's a way in which I'm kind of reminded of that formulation in Erich Fromm's 1940s book, right? Escape from Freedom, where the figure, the psychosocial type of the far right is the authoritarian rebel. And I think a lot of these insurgent disruptions take that form, right? They perform a sort of enjoyment and a practice of rebellion, but always with the premise and the desire, right, for another better, more stable order. So we can definitely see them as insurgencies, and indeed on the fringes, of course, we find much, we find forms of right-wing mobilization, often with very disturbing racist overtones, but which nevertheless is kind of, genuinely anti-statist or genuinely against the established forces of order, but I still think takes that form of authoritarian rebellion. Now, one thing that I think would be interesting to note, maybe vis-a-vis Massimiliano's arguments, I'll just take the opportunity of this question maybe to delve into it further, is that of course there are trends in right-wing thought which see themselves as affirming pluralism, affirming the plurality of concrete orders in one sense, and also see themselves as affirming critique, right, of homogenizing dominant model of the state, including of the modern nation state, right? So there's if you think of a lot of what came and comes out of the Nouvelle Droite in France, right, was explicitly articulated around what it saw as the restrictive, disastrous forms of modernity that linked, global capitalism to the modern nation state, right? And instead posed a pluralism of small nations, or indeed even tribes with nebulously defined, ethnic identities and the like. So I think it's not insignificant that there are these imaginaries of pluralism and imaginaries of anti-statism and imaginaries of alternative modernity on the right. I don't think they're by any means dominant. I'm not entirely sure they're even that significant to the dynamics of powerful forces on the right, not least because they go against many of the imperatives of capitalist reproduction if they're taken really seriously. But I think still it's an interesting thing to keep in mind, right? And I was also, it's also interesting if one thinks of even the juridical thinking of the European far right. Indeed, the juridical thinking under National Socialism. Has anybody ever been more against Roman law than Nazis? Probably not. Schmidt himself was, had to retract his own, faithfulness to aspects of Roman law in order to, kind of get with the program. So, of course, and there was all sorts of speculation by Nazi jurists about German freedoms, about conceptions of possessions that were not property, right? So there's these things don't just take place like on our side, right? This is not to say that this should make us worried and contaminates thinkings of alternatives to modernity, but I still think it's worth soberly thinking through, right? Especially around the question of pluralism, I think, more than necessarily around the question of insurgency per se.
Yes, Aldo, you want to say something? Or yes, Max, you want 1 minute? Yes, you can have it.
Okay, I can jump in. Aldo, you want to go first?
Yes, you go first.
I can go first. Very quickly. I think that, as you said, Massimiliano, we agree. We agree, of course, on the fundamental issues, but also beyond that. I think that we share the concern of debating universality, and as you put it, with the Zapatista statement, let's say some voices within post-colonial theory would underline the multiplicity or the multiple worlds. And some of us are still considering that, but asking ourselves once again about the question of a possible universality, the one world in which this plurality could take place. I think that's a crucial statement. Another one is, and I think this is, it's very good to hear it from you. It gives another light to your book. You framed it in the following way: practice as theory in action. So you're not only putting the Zapatistas or the Communards together with Benjamin and Marx and Koselleck and Bloch, but you're also conceiving them as authors themselves, and even beyond, as the privileged authors of our specific time. So, because if I read you, if I understand it correctly, you say, well, we still have the theoretical arsenal available to us. We have the different traditions within European thought, within also, let's say, non-continental understanding, philosophy, history of philosophy. We have those categories, and we can reach into them in order to rethink alternatives. But in this period of time, the real authors are those movements that you called practice as theory in action. But then, I mean, these are all very, very complex ideas. I mean, you could also say it if you read into an Adornian understanding of Hegel, let's say not the classical reading of Hegel, but if you read into the Adornian understanding of Hegel, you can also ask yourself, or I ask myself, if you're not putting a different, somehow putting in a different perspective, the old idea of the realization of the concept of humanity in history, but from below, just to extend a little bit the metaphor. You're not focusing on the big narrative that's what's sold to us based on the European tradition, etc. So looking into the realization of the human project from below in a very Benjaminian, I would say, spirit. And then the question, this is also, once again, I think a very complicated question to answer now, but practice as theory in action, certain social events, certain insurgents. But the question is, and probably this relates to the question that was asked previously, not every insurgency should be or could be considered practice in action. And you more or less signaled certain criteria to answer this question. When you were talking about the experiments, and I want to ask you about this, I want to ask you if you've thought a little bit more about these, the way to understand the experiment. But you mentioned that the experiment of the realization of the concept of humanity from below, if I may put it like that, this experiment has like a normative element, which would be the exclusion of other experiments. And then you reached out to the Italian tradition. So fascism, Italian fascism, as an experiment that understood itself as a closed experiment, as a finished experiment. It did not conceive itself, and we agree in that, as an unfinished project. It was already a finished project that just needed to be implemented, and that itself was not compatible with other coexistent projects. So then the question would be probably not every insurgency is or has the possibility of creating a new universality. And probably those who are not able to recreate a universal claim are those who, in principle, cannot recognize the otherness in a symmetrical way. So without this reciprocal recognition, the experiment would not work, to put it bluntly somehow. But this is only a big question, and I would like to refer to the question about the right, and I think that we could also work an answer with Massimiliano's ideas, in the sense I would just very, very provisionally claim that the right doesn't have, in this moment, in this historical period, doesn't have a problem with relating to its past. So the right is actually working with its past in a very free and motivated way. And the left, if there's the many expressions of the left in the global south, the global north, and Latin America and Europe, is still struggling with its relation between the past and the future. I believe that the left is still struggling with the answer for the future, but has somehow, as Massimiliano stated, broken the dialectic between past and future, and once again accepted the closure of the past. It's a very abstract hint, but I think that probably we can read, let's say, the strength, or some kind of strength that the right has obtained in this period of time, probably mainly in Europe, if I see the Italian case, the French case, the German case, the Spanish case. Probably because the way through which they're working with the resources provided to them from their own understanding of the past, and the way they're actualizing those resources in order to create a viable, regressive notion of future. And the left's still struggling with that. That would be my point. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Aldo. We have two questions before I give the floor again to Max. so that Max can include also these questions. And you can also, so the first question is from Owen Holland, and it is, with reference to the Commune of 1851, if one thinks in terms of restoration rather than revolution, is there not some possibility that the key mobilizing agency or effect will be nostalgia? Notwithstanding Michel Levy's work on Romanticism, nostalgia won't necessarily allow for a productive politics, make America great again, etc. But I take it that Massimiliano is envisaging a more productive mobilization of nostalgia. Might he want to comment on this? This is the first question from Comrade Owen Holland. And the second question is from Samuel O'Connor, Perks, and it is Bloch more important for understanding the digger's legacy than historians such as Christopher Hill? What does a non-synchronous reading of class struggle so that Hill's Marxist history does not? So these are two questions that Marx can also include in his response, and also response to what Aldo and Alberto have said.
Okay, thank you. Okay, want to start with the right-wing populism. Very short comment. I would say that one thing I'm doing, or I'm trying to do in Insurgent Universality, and even more in my new book, is a form of a reappropriation of what is ours, if you want. So what I mean is terms like tradition, past, religion, authority, community, obligations, and others. This, as a Bloch would have said, these terms belong to our tradition, but the left has left all these terms, and the right has stolen, and they have appropriated these terms, and they are using the past. They are monopolizing the past, and I think this is a part of the problem. And I think Aldo said something in the similar direction. Oh, another term is a pluralism, as Alberto said. Pluralism belongs to our tradition, or one of our traditions, and I had a conversation, I think 1 year ago or 2 years ago, I don't remember, with a kind of a left liberal here in California, because in California there was a recall. That is this right to call back one of your representatives. And this left liberal was totally against recall, that he defined as a right-wing Republican institution. And I said, really? I saw recall in the Paris Commune, in the German Council's Republic, in the Russian Revolution. I think it's something that belongs to us. The problem is that we forgot that this institution is a part of our tradition, and now we attack recall as something that belongs to the Republican and the right wings. So I think we cannot move 1 inch from where we are if we still work with this opposition that is even a kind of internal opposition. We are playing concepts like state, secularism, progress, society against community, in a way that basically we are giving to the right so many weapons to mobilize people. Because some of these terms, as a Bloch would have said again, they belong to the more emotional, active tradition of Marxism. We don't convince people with a cold analysis of the crisis. We need to find a way to talk to what is immediate to people's needs. I think it's a kind of, trying to go back to history 101. And again, and I think it can happen by reappropriating what is ours. And that allows me to say one thing about restoration and nostalgia. Exactly, they are not the same. They are not the same thing. I think, in a certain way, we can discuss about the semantic of the term, nostalgia or romanticism, but restoration doesn't mean to go back, because that still assumes a unilinear historical time. And then you go back and you restore something and you move on. No, if we understand a multiverse of historical times, you don't go back. You just jump into a different layer, a different historical layer, and you extract from this different layer material that you need to reconfigure the present. It's not nostalgia. Can be a different. Obviously, is also a different narrative of history, and this is what happens with the diggers, for example, when they refer to the Norman yoke, but in a way that is completely different from the dominant British narrative. For them, the Norman yoke, or what precedes the Norman yoke, was not better than what came after, because it was still affected by property and domination. So, and their way to restore the past for the diggers was just to go back to what we can find in the Bible. Is abstract? Yes and no, because that was the emotional language of the people and the peasants. So the difficulty is to work with all these different languages and grammars simultaneously at the same time. And yes, I agree that in a certain way, reading the diggers with the block can be more productive than rereading the diggers with Christopher Hill, because of what you get with the block. Now I become a little bit more philosopher, but what you get with the block is the distinction that he made in his book on Thomas Münther, a book that has to be translated into English as soon as possible, in my opinion. In his book on Münther, Bloch made this distinction between two forms of memory or rememoration. So Erinnerung that belongs to the kind of a Hegelian tradition, and Eingedenken, that is the term that Walter Benjamin will use. So an Eingedenken is about the openness of the past. So if we are reading Thomas Münther today and the German Peasants' War today that happened in 1525, is because that possibility is still open, because that trajectory was crashed, but is still open. And the point is that was crashed as an episode of, I don't know how to call it, of internal colonialism, was crashed in order for Europe to impose what we call Eurocentrism, or the dominant trajectory of Western modernity, but was only one. So if we still talk about Europe as a monolithic thing that is dominant and colonial, basically we kill the peasants in 1525 once again. We kill the communards once again, because these people were trying to go in a different direction. They showed us alternatives. And the dominant trajectory of Europe, of the Western dominant trajectory, defined itself through those massacres, in the conflict with those massacres. And this is maybe a kind of a, not an answer, but just a first step for a conversation with Aldo, I would say maybe it's not about rewriting the history from below against the history from above, the dominant history. I think it's more about how can we work in the tension between these two dimensions, from below and from above, because I think it's the tension that modifies both. And what I was saying before about an alternative canon, and what makes an alternative canon very difficult is basically because the focus of the alternative canon should be the tension between these two dimensions, in which both elements are modified at the same time. So even the so when Luther crushed Münzer, Protestantism, Reformation became something else because of that conflict. And I think we should start thinking in this way. I think there is more, but maybe there are more questions.
Okay, well, yeah, we have another question. If you want to say, but very a short answer, Max. The question is from Leonel Diogo, and the question is, how should we consider online movements, whether this virtual aspect affects our thinking?
my honest answer is I don't know, but what I know is what I learned from the right. There is a documentary on Steve Bannon, American Dharma by Arrow. At a certain point in this documentary, I really recommend to watch this documentary. At a certain point, Steve Bannon tells a story, and this is the story of Dave. Dave, in the real life, is what Steve Bannon called a loser, a guy that lives with his mother. He has a family, but the family is totally neglected. He doesn't care about the family. He sits on his couch, he eats junk food all the time, and he plays video games all the time. And there is a hero. So the point is, and he has I don't remember the name, he has a different name in the video game, obviously. And in the video game, this Dave is the man, is the hero. Is a multiplayer video game. Okay, at a certain point, Dave passed away. When the players knew about that their hero is dead, they organized a funeral in the video game. Hundreds or thousands of players were at the funeral. But because there is another faction, the opposite faction took the opportunity to attack the friends of Dave. A war began online in the video game. Okay, now Steve Bannon said, maybe the story is a fake, I don't know. But then Steve Bannon said, that day, hundreds of people didn't go to school. They didn't go to work. They were playing to defend their hero in the video game. So the video game, what they were doing there was affecting what we call the real world, the real reality. But Steve Bannon asked, so, and now what is real? Is more real the life that Dave had in the video game, in which he was able to mobilize thousands of people, or the life of Dave that he spent sitting on the couch and eating junk food. So what I would say is not an answer, but what I would say is that I think the right wing has learned or is learning how to weaponize virtual reality in a way that the left doesn't do. But I'm not sure about it. I just when I heard this description by Steve Bannon, obviously as everybody else, I made an immediate link between what he said, and that was before January 6th, and then the insurrection of January 6th. So how what you can create in this virtual reality can affect at least a few people, some people, what we call the real world. And then again, the question is, what is real? How many level of realities? But I have questions about that. I don't have a real answer. I think better for us to learn how to deal with the online politics and online movements as soon as possible, and without being dismissive. I'm not dismissive. I don't buy, but I'm not dismissive of a conspiracy theories. There is something there. There is a gigantic dissatisfaction with the dominant narrative, but they go in a crazy direction. But the point is, who is able to orient this huge amount of dissatisfaction? For sure, not the left. And I think this is a problem.
Okay, thanks a lot, Max. I think we can wrap it up now, unless Aldo or Alberto want to add something. Okay, well, if they do not, yes, Alberto.
No.
Okay. Okay, in that case, I would like to thank, first of all, our panel, beginning with Massimiliano Tomba, Aldo Beretta, and Alberto Toscano. I would also like to thank all of you who watched us live tonight. This broadcast will remain on the YouTube channel of Haymarket, and we will circulate it as broadly as possible. Please stay tuned for our next historical materialism broadcasts and also our next historical materialism podcasts. By the way, we also have a podcast with Massimiliano, which was recorded some days ago, so you can also look for that also. As usual, please support the Historical Materialism Project in any way possible, with donations, with subscriptions to the journal, with buying the books either institutionally by Brill or yourselves through Haymarket at a really affordable prices. And as Massimiliano Tomba insisted repeatedly tonight, it's really important to keep on learning and changing ourselves through what we see happening in struggles, and, you know, try to be part of perhaps a new version of Insurgent Universality, I think, which is more than ever needed today. So many, many thanks. Good night, and keep the struggle.
Thank you so much. Bye.